So we are going to invite you to join us in a responsive reading. Rodney is going to read some things, I'm going to read some things, and when it's your turn to read some things, we're going to point to the screen. You have traveled where I am traveling.
I would like to know what brings you the most joy.
We do share this ever-turning, heating planet.
Across experience,
Across the changes we all face, the turbulence, the peaceful parts.
you will travel where I am traveling.
No age travels the same path.
Nor explores the same world.
Let's connect. Thank you. Can we just take a moment and be grateful for all the wisdom and gifts we've already received in this service? Just so wonderful. Let's just thank you. And the choir, having the choir back. Y'all, I'm going to be celebrating that for 2 full years, having the choir back. So as we all know, generational jokes abound. Here's one. A mother texts. This is in honor of Mother's Day. A mother texts, "Son, what do IDK, LY, and TTYL mean?" And he texts us back, "I don't know, love ya, talk to you later." Just saying. You know, as a child, I remember the gap between me and my grandparent seemed huge. I only had one that I knew. It was my grandfather. 2 had died before I was born, and my relationship with my Japanese-American grandmother was caught up in my parents' divorce. My grandfather, though, was born in 1898. He lived to be 102, which was not a thing in his day, I need to say. Both of my parents were children of older parents, which was also very rare in those times. And so we had an extra generational gap between me and my only grandparent. My grandfather remembered a day before automobiles and planes, which always seemed astounding to me. And I thought the difference between his lifetime and my lifetime was probably going to be the biggest there ever was in terms of change. Probably not. The generational divide, though, has been widening for many reasons over the last decade, and especially in the pandemic. And just a few weeks ago, the story broke that millennials now outnumber baby boomers in our nation, and that for a limited time, we will have boomers, Gen X, Gen Ys, millennials, and what's emerging as Gen Z all in the same workforce, and that is not supposed to be pretty. Sometimes the gaps between generations can seem unbridgeable. A recent article concluded that COVID-19 has widened the generational divide between older adults and younger people because the pandemic has reinforced the misperception that older adults are weak and need to be protected, and social distancing has separated many generations and families. Okay, that's a little pessimistic. Let's juxtapose that truth with another one and some other opinions. You've heard some of them in our call to worship. I do want to note, though, that those who responded to our weeks of inquiry, almost none of them were from the millennial. None of them, in fact, were from the millennial or other generations. So it's important to note that. So let's juxtapose, though, some other things, like Jerry Duffy, who's a professor at King's College in London, who says that despite the myths, such as the fact that baby boomers have ruined parenting forever, or that millennials have destroyed the napkin industry. You got to think about that. I actually had to think about that. That's interesting. Things aren't as bad as they seem. The author of a rather massive new book called Generations has a bottom line, which is this. He says, generational thinking is a really useful idea that has been corrupted by being misapplied. Colby Takada, a Japanese American from the millennial generation, who is at 25, took over a large senior living residence in Hawaii. And he said he was able to do that in part because he was an Encore Fellow. He was in a program that intentionally brings leaders of different generations together so that they can share their wisdom. So that is some of the better news. Generational relations are all a swirl in these times, and it has long been the case that Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latinx, Arabic, and other communities tend to honor multi-generational relationships in a little bit more active way. The dominant culture has tended to emphasize generational difference, and it's actually become a really important part of business models and marketing, which has reinforced that. With the growth of understanding of the rainbow of sexual orientations and gender identities has come the idea that Andrew mentioned, that of chosen family, necessitated by the rejection of truths by those biologically related and the pain related to that. And to all of us as people who care about the human family, I think this issue of generations and how we reach out across them is really worth considering a bit more. Other changes I've been reminded of this spring have come about by the number of lives that we've celebrated, and we've had many, many, and we'll still have many celebrations of life this spring. The majority of the people that we've marked this year lived up into their late 80s, and that is now more common, as it is now also more common for people to do what my grandfather did and go up to the century mark or beyond. People also remain children actively, with moms and dads sometimes into their 80s. And that's a really different situation than we tend to think about. Duffy says, you can only understand the future if you understand what is generational. He says that what's significant about generational difference are the events that we experience at any one time, such as period events, which are economic prosperity in certain times, or economic downfall, or social change, or a pandemic, which we've shared. There are also generational events that are life cycle events. Those are the natural effects of aging, and he points out that while we have generational differences, one thing that's different about generational differences is that eventually, if all goes well, we all kind of get to experience all the different stops along the way. So it changes. He also says there are cohort effects, the specific experiences of a generation, such as those who are now living in Afghanistan or Ukraine will forever hold as a mark among them. Duffy says we overestimate what we worry about, and that is magnified by the increasingly sensationalized nature of news, which does nothing for intergenerational relationships or stereotypes. He observes that you would rarely see this headline: non-pregnant teenager just getting on with stuff. Hardly ever happens. Misperceptions are sometimes useful indicators, though, about where we're really worried together. And myth-busting that just tries to clear up facts is ignoring the emotional concerns that different generations have in their relationships with one another and that can help them move closer. Another effect, he says, is what he calls rosy retrospection, the idea that it was always better back in the day, right? Better back in the day, and the longer you go, the more of those days are behind you, and the fewer that are before you, and so it becomes easier to be caught in rosy retrospection, as he says. He says an example of that is that the murder rate is actually down in this nation and has been for a long time, and in many other countries in Europe, and yet most think it is higher. He again reminds us of one of the principles of our media, which is if it bleeds, it leads. And this keeps reinforcing those dividing generalizations. Humor, in addition to myths, are another place that often reveals where the fissions are. So there's a website called, I'm sorry about this in the spirit of Mother's Day, but it is called scarymommy.com. And it has some boomer and millennial jokes. You can go and read the rest of them if you like this selection. You can listen carefully and see if you can tell which are which. Number 1, I'm getting so sick of millennials and their attitudes, always walking around like they rent the place. If I had $1 for every time a boomer insulted me, I could afford a house in the economy they ruined. What did the millennial say to the boomer upset about being called boomer? The same thing boomers said to them growing up. They're just words. They can't hurt you. And baby boomers, the ones outspending their children's inheritance. So we need, as we can tell, if the humor is assigned, to be actively working across generational lines. And we need places where we can practice that, leaving our stereotypes at the door. While millennials and Gen Zers are rightfully angry, for example, at the state of our climate or our economy and our inequality in our society, which persists, in truth, so are many in generations X, Y, and boomers. And as to the culture wars that we hear so much about, it's interesting to realize that this is a term that was originally coined by the far political right, the culture wars, and yet it has been particularly taken on by the majority of baby boomers now. A more diversified world is just a reality. Gen Zers, it was just recently announced, are by far the most diverse generation in this nation since colonization. So the wisdom of those indigenous to this nation might be worth looking at here. The idea of considering 7 generations is almost a cliche when one refers to indigenous context. And yet it has also been mythologized. As Lakota elder and author of God is Red, Vine Deloria says, he speaks of the 7 generations in very practical terms. In his cantankerous way, he would express extreme annoyance at the romanticism of this concept of 7 generations. He would say, as it was explained to him in his culture, the generations we have sworn to protect and revere are the 7 that we're most immediately connected to. It doesn't have to be that theoretical, he says. Stop worrying 7 back or 7 up. Just worry about your kids and your grandkids, your parents and your grandparents, and how to be in relationship with them. Duffy also notes that we always think the youngest generation is the worst ever, the weirdest ever, and that started with Socrates, who thought that the younger people were rude and unpleasant. Duffy says that we need to come to understand that tension between generations is not actually bad. It's a sign that there's foment and change, and that which does not change irresistibly dies, and so change is always good societally. Yet with the isolating effects of an age-segmented social media and fewer opportunities to be together with people of different generations, especially if we're not related, we may be in a particular time when paying attention to our generations makes sense. Both sides benefit, and we all need to engage in longer-term thinking. It's not about how old versus young, Duffy says. It's about how we all are willing to look at the future. Only 30% of U.S. citizens think things will be better for their children, and that's a higher rate than Great Britain or any of the European countries. And the evidence says that it might be true. The ability to own a home in this country has decreased in every generation since the first half of the baby boom. Many believe that this gap feels worse because of one of those period effects. We hear more from extreme points of view, and yet that is in tension with the fact that inequity is increasingly generational and intergenerational. A lot of wealth concentrated in a subset of older groups means that there is a decline of public programs, and private wealth has become more important to ensure that people have basic needs like housing and job security. Generational thinking is an incredibly powerful ideal that has been corrupted, as he said, by stereotypes like considering that the boomers are materialistic or narcissistical, or that millennials are all snowflakes. So challenging the myths by looking at real experience and by using places like this congregation, which does have a multi-generational community, is really an important thing to do. We need to listen to the truths, especially from some of our younger generations who were, in the pandemic, the first to be let go from their jobs, though the older workers are having the hardest time getting back in because of the ways that technology has become more central. We've got an incredible amount of agency, Duffy says, to change things for the good or the bad, and having a long-term generational view gives us the idea that we can achieve change. And here, As a multi-generational community, as we were gifted to be reminded of last week by our youth service, which if you haven't seen, you should check out on our YouTube channel, The Heart of Which, we can continue to bridge this really important area. As people who care about one another, who care about our planet, who care about the world's children, we have a choice now. We can allow the bridging the gap to continue to widen as it has been over these last years, or we can do what we decide we can to help weave a net over that. We can be grateful for los hermanos, those that have come before us. We can know that love has broken down some walls and can continue to do if we're patient and willing to listen. We can build a new way. We can talk and share, reach out, collaborate, and question. We can draw the circle wide. And let's do that in the spirit of this day.